Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm John Negroni. I'm a published fantasy author with over 10 years of experience as a professional writer and editor. On Fantasy Writing for Barbarians, my goal is to help you wherever you're at in your journey when it comes to writing in the fantasy genre. As usual, we're going to take a look at an advice prompt today from somebody who is an aspiring author, and I'm going to do my best to give them some advice. I have not read this prompt ahead of time, also as usual. But I know that our wonderful producer, Natalia Emmons, has chosen something that either we haven't covered before or we're going to cover in some more detail. I try not to give too many rules to it. So I've told Natalia, if you feel like we haven't totally covered a topic, maybe that's a good sign that we can cover it again, because you never know. Maybe there's some more insights to be had. But all right, so I'm going to open up the prompt now and see what our producer, Natalia, has for us today. And at the end of the show, we'll of course turn it over to our other producer, Bridget Zerdock, for fact checks and clarifications. Because again, I'm reacting to this for the first time. I might mess up. All right, so here's what we got from username NixTheJinx928. I definitely, when I see Jinx, I immediately have an arcane flashback. There's a little bit of trauma there, but we'll have to disregard that. But all right, this is in the Fantasy Writers subreddit on reddit.com, and NixTheJinx writes, "How do you name your characters? I'm at a loss. I'm trying to complete the name of my main character in my work in progress. The main character is a magical human character with powers similar to a nature witch/druid. Not exactly like either of those, but close. I decided that I wanted her to have the name of a poisonous flower and to make it a family tradition type of thing. My character's first name is Oleander, nickname still under debate. Her mother's name is Azalea. Both are the names of highly toxic flowers that are beautiful but deadly. My question is, how do I come up with a last name? When I think I might like something, I put it together with both names and do research to ensure the names are appropriate for my story, but I'm having the hardest time. Any ideas or advice?" All right, and there are quite a few comments here too, so we'll be able to look at what some of the other folks in this community had to say to NixTheJinx's request here. Off the top of the bat, I think I mentioned literally in the last episode that when it comes to names, I actually love using names as a theme when I'm doing my writing. I really have a fascination with how names work, and especially because names are given to us. And I really like how Nix here has already done some good work, and some good creative work in weaving some purpose and some continuity and distinction with the names of these two related characters. I think that's a really fun idea and concept, something that makes it memorable to use highly toxic flowers. Of course, they are running into the issue of, well, what do you do for the last name? And there are a lot of different strategies you can do. I know for me, I think the number one thing that you always want to make sure you're paying attention to is that the names for your characters, you want them to flow while you're actually reading the novel. You want it to be something, if you read it out loud, it goes together, in both ways, without it feeling like a stumbling block. I think I did a critique once. I don't remember if we published it, but we did a critique once where I've just found the name of the character to be a bit of a stumbling block for me. And so that said, if you have that kind of figured out at the very least, then you can sort of move into, all right, well, how does the world building actually inform the type of name that I'm going to have here? So you mentioned that this is a magical human character. We don't know too much about your world otherwise, like if there are other species, because you did say human character, so you're either being specific to, that you don't want us to be confused with another type of creature. That could also mean that there are humans, but then there are all other creatures. This is a fantasy novel, and you mentioned that they're a nature witch and a druid, so that definitely leads me to believe that there are other creatures and species and things like that. I think it's fun and a nice discovery writing exercise to maybe write out some world building that can help you with this. So you can sit down and say, all right, what is the history of the humans in this world? If this is a second world type of fantasy, second world, of course, referring to a fantasy world that is not like a direct, planet Earth, our continuity and all that. But instead, something like, Poppy Wars, a second world fantasy, Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, those are all second world. And so then from there, you want to maybe on that note, actually, take a look at what real life settings and cultures influence your story the most. You mentioned a thing about the flowers, but in terms of witches, there are lots of different witches throughout human history, witches coming all over from Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean to the Roman Empire. There are different witches, of course, the more, traditional Western European, Anglo-Saxon, all of that stuff. So you can use that as a nice kind of way to inform your character name. So you can take Oleander and maybe do something that just sounds nice with it. My first glance, to be more specific to your prompt here, you have two names given as an example. Oleander. That's 4 syllables, right? Oleander. Yeah, I can do these things. And Azalea. Those are 4-syllable names. You have maybe 2 options here. You can either do a last name that is also 4 or 5 syllables, and so to make it very flowery, pun not really intended. Or you can do something that is 1 syllable and a little punchier, which is what I would prefer as a reader. So something like Oleander Swift, something that kind of just punches it. Now, I wouldn't go with Swift because I just thought of Swift because of the novel Babel. And so that's the last name of that main character. But it works a lot of the time to take, when you have a long syllable name and a last name, for them to kind of be the inverse of each other. So I say this as someone who has a multi-syllable first name and last name. So my full name is Jonathan Negroni. And when I was a kid, I wanted to go by John Negroni because I did not like how my name took so long to say. And you can work that kind of thing. Like, does that make sense for your character? Would they be the kind of character who wants to have a nickname because their first and last name is so many syllables? You could make that part of the story and their personality of like, my name is, Oleander, Sparkler or something like that. And it's like that's a lot to say, right? It may be a more serious, I'll use maybe, for example, if you decided the last name would be a non-toxic flower. So Oleander chrysanthemum, which, again, that's not a good last name, but I'm using it as an example. So if your character was like, oh, my name is like so flowery, it's got so much, I want my nickname then to be Ollie, right? Or Oli or something like that. Oli is actually, I think, the name of a character in that show Sex Education, if I'm not mistaken. So there's a little bit of context you could use there. I know the Jinx said that the nickname is still under debate. But all that said, like, that would make sense for that character, right? Or if they just went by Ander, like, oh, I just want to go by Ander because my last name is so long. The other way to go about that is for it to be like a shorter last name. So like, again, maybe not Swift, but let's say it was Stem, because I'm just going with the flower stuff. But Oleander Stem. Then would it make sense for their nickname if their nickname was Ander? So Ander Stem. That sounds kind of weird, right? So you want to put a little bit of planning into this. And another thing that you can work it in too is that what kind of witch is this? Is this a witch who uses a lot of spells? Who is spells take recipes, they take a lot of planning and preparation. Are they details oriented? These are things that feed into what will feel right for your character. Is your character somebody who, if you have a shorter syllable name, that means you're probably a shorter, more abrupt person, So think of how dwarves tend to have more guttural names like, Gimli, because that informs their personality. That's kind of what I was alluding to before when I was saying how coming up with the name of a fantasy character, I think like names in general just tend to be something that they're given to us, and yet they inform our personalities. And a lot of people don't have a lot of control over their names. And that tends to be a point of contention for a lot of people. A point of growth and human development is coming to terms with your name and how people perceive you and how how that informs your personality as a result. There's so many complicated layers to that. And so these are things, kind of more psychology details you might want to consider when you're putting your story together as well. And that's probably why you're having a hard time, is because you are trying to make this feel right. Because I get the sense that Nyx, the Jinx here, has an idea of what I'm talking about already. And that's why they're having an issue, because they're like, well, whatever name they're coming up with, it just isn't feeling right. So you want to get to the place where it feels right. And that's a sign to me that your character isn't fully baked yet, which they might be very close to fully baked. But in terms of, where their personality is in the beginning of the story and where it ends, that's really going to inform what makes sense, for your character and how they're going to, come out of your story in whatever way. So hopefully that's a little bit helpful. I'm trying, of course, to make sure, that I'm not overly prescribing how to do this. I'd say that, again, really pay attention to the flow, pay attention to the tone of your story, right? If the tone of your story is a little bit lighter, you kind of, it seems to me like the tone of your story is like beautiful but toxic, like a toxic flower. So if that's kind of the style of your story, you want the last name to match that tone as well. Or you want it to fit in with the tone. So if their first name is toxic but beautiful, could the last name be maybe the inverse of that, like comforting but also severe, like some kind of contradiction? You could use that as a way to go. And you could also work it into, maybe the main character's last name is a name from, their other parent who, assuming you have like a patriarchal name, I don't even know how you would say that, but like the name passing from the father to the daughter instead of the mother, would that kind of, fit into the story as well? So basically the main character's last name is her father's last name. And so it doesn't really go with the first name. And then that creates like a whole point of contention. It just sort of depends. I'm not entirely sure what your story is actually going for there. And I do think that one of my favorite books when it comes to getting this sort of thing right, and I got to be honest, there are a lot of books with naming systems that I find very strange, that don't work very well. For me, like I know I harp on Fourth Wing a lot, but when I was reading Fourth Wing and the main character's name is Violet, I was just very like, that's the name? Like that didn't feel right to me. It didn't feel like that matched the tone of the story. Her name was just kind of like, I don't know, it just felt like a placeholder name to me. And there are a lot of times when I've seen people complain about main character names for female protagonists being like performatively masculine. So there was like this trend. It was more so like several years ago, but I remember a lot of books were doing this thing where like the female main character's first name was male coded. So like Clark or Wolf or something like that. And there was a little bit of backlash to that of like, they can have feminine first names and still be, this like kind of strong, awesome, fighter character or whatever. I forget exactly all the details of that, whatever controversy, but that's another thing to take. I don't think that applies to this prompt since they have the first name figured out. And I think it's a nice first name personally. The other thing too, I didn't even mention the book where I like the naming system a lot is I like how the Targaryens are handled in Game of Thrones and the whole Song of Ice and Fire series, of course, because that is a naming system that has a specific set of rules for the Targaryens, right? A lot of the names have A and E, but it makes sense for why that is the case because they want people to understand it's like a royal line, the bloodline, right? There's two things to it. They want these Targaryens to stand out. When you hear the names, right, you want the people to understand like, oh gosh, yeah, that's a Targaryen. But then you also have all these Targaryen characters who have first names from, a lot of them are named Aegon because that was like the super famous conqueror who did all these amazing things. And so people keep trying to name their sons Aegon in order to like live up to that, right? And then you have other characters who are like, well, they don't want to live up to Aegon, they want to be the first of their name. So it fits into the story and it's a small little touch like A and E. And then there's all kinds of names that go from there, like Aemond, Aerion, Daeron. Like it's just one of those things where I think Martin stuck with a convention and he added like lots of little twists to it. And then elsewhere in that book, you also, contrastly have the other families of Westeros always using different names in order to honor other people. There are a bunch of characters named John, because Jon Arryn was a big deal at one point. And even way before that, I think that's a Stark thing. There were so many Johns in like the Stark family history. But, also names like, Robert Baratheon. You had Ned's firstborn son is Robb Stark, right? And then you also had Jon Arryn's son was named Sweet Robin, because they wanted to sort of name him Robert after Robert Baratheon. So it's stuff like that, where you try to work it into the story as well so it's meaningful and it really lasts. Okay, so let's take a look at what some other folks had to say about their names. Okay, so Orbajo wrote, you have to make a choice on whether you're stylizing or not. If not, then you should be naming them what you think their parents would name them, or a step above, a name that suggests their social status. The last tier being naming them then like Pokemon, where you call a guy Scorchio Embers and he can breathe fire. Remember, their parents will have the same surname if that's the rules of your world. For example, Speed Racer being named Speed Racer, and his parents' surname is Racer. This is silly, but it fits the vibe of the show. Yeah, my only thing with that is I think Nyx is really looking for the last name, the surname, as you're saying. And so that really isn't something that comes into play with the parents because, like, they're not really choosing the surname. The surname is already kind of figured out. Acceptable Dare 8945 writes, maybe instead of searching for flower names, you search for something that makes the sense of deadly stronger. They already have poisonous flower as names, so you can make a tradition, poisonous flower plus deadly thing/name. The name already describes the flower, so the family could be some kind of support for the meaning. Another thing you could do is simply not think about it. Having a cool name is great, but not everything has to have a deeper meaning. If you choose something simple, you will get accustomed to it with time. It's exhausting to make everything have a deeper meaning, so I recommend not thinking about it too much. Yeah, I disagree. I think that I think with your main character, the name is really important. As I was kind of saying before, it's one of those things where if you don't get the name right and you don't give it like a lot of thought, it is one of those things that can rub the readers the wrong way and make them have trouble immersing, honestly. And I think giving it some meaning kind of is just like a way to be a good writer. Like, I think all your work should have some meaning to it. And I think, yeah, no, having deeper meaning is a good thing. I wouldn't look at that and be like, like that's a bad thing at all. And I also think this thing of like, we'll get accustomed to it with time. That's actually not great because, well, first of all, what happens if you don't get accustomed to it with time and then you end up having to go back and change it? But then also, I think that you want it to be good enough so that a lot of the readers are not going to have that same feeling, where there's something uncanny or it doesn't feel right, So yeah, I gotta say, I don't really agree with that. The whole thing where they say though, like, try to like work in like the first name kind of means this, last name kind of means this. I think that part of the advice is fine. I mean, that's kind of what I was saying too. But yeah, I think that that's what they specifically do need help with, of like brainstorming that and trying to figure out like what goes with a poisonous flower. Again, that's why I think my thing of like, maybe something a little bit simpler for the last name. So you can have like, the flow of it would be like da, 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 da. There's like a rhythm to that you kind of want to, hone in on. All right, that Shy Girl 06 wrote, figure out the culture of your people and how that would influence their names. I think the OP has already done that. You can look at real life cultures to get ideas. Yes, that I agree with. I've made a conlang, I don't know what that is. And within my story, they have a bloodline name and a clan name, which comes before their given name, like Korean names. Yeah, I've done something like that too. I think that can be kind of fun. One of my first novels, I wanted to do look at how the bloodline name, the clan name can be like sort of switched around and add meaning to that. For me, there was meaning because there was a contrast of cultures and it informed kind of like people who stood out. And then it wasn't until like later on though, where I found that, the Japanese sort of, I don't know too much about the Korean context for your first name being second. But one thing though that did stick out to me in Japanese culture was how it's so disrespectful to call somebody by their first name. If you don't have a close connection to someone, if you don't acknowledge them, it is, of course, customary and polite to refer to people by their family name. So people would call me, Negroni, Mr. Negroni. They would not call me John or Jonathan unless they really knew me. And that's just not something that we are used to, in the West quite at all. And those are like little details that can make your fantasy novel, borrowing from real life, but also making it kind of feel real, feel authentic. And so I like using histories and cultures in that way too. There are a lot of different things though that are less well known, that you could borrow from. I think that, for my own culture, Puerto Rico, it's customary for a lot of Puerto Ricans, not really much anymore, but my family is like this. I don't have a middle name. And technically I'm supposed to have two last names, my father's last name and then my mother's maiden name. And that's a very common thing. It just turned out that I didn't get two last names or a middle name, so I just have a first and last. But yeah, it's stuff like that you can find little things like that in all kinds of cultures all over the world, stuff that isn't as recognizable or things that people will realize. You can use that, of course. You could look at that and say, what if, you don't have a last name, you just have a first name and then some kind of other moniker to, tie you to your family. That'd be kind of interesting. All right, let's take a look at one more comment here. 10 Panoptica writes, since you already have meaningful first names you like, I just focus on getting a good sound combo with the last name. All right, that's pretty much what I was saying. Poetry techniques, stress patterns, consonants are helpful here. Once you have a sound combo you like, you can create lore to justify it, whether it's a common name, word, or just something you made up. Yeah, I think this is exactly right, because that's what I mean. It's like start with the thing that sounds right, and then maybe find a list of last names, and then if something really sticks out, you can retroactively add the deeper meaning later, And I think that is the thing that is going to take priority. It's like, does it sound right? And then the deeper meaning it doesn't have to be the meaning of the word itself, but it can be if you have a nice happy accident in which that's something you can pull off. All right, well, that's about all I got for this one. I'm going to turn it over to Bridget, see if there's anything I said that was incorrect or misleading or needs clarification. And so don't go away. We'll be right back. And we're back. All right, I have some notes here from producer Bridget. So excited to get into this now. So here's what they had to say. First of all, apparently Bridget appreciated my arcane Easter egg there. I don't even know if it's an Easter egg because I forget exactly what I said. The Jinx trauma comment. And Bridget did ask me if I've finished Arcane. I have not finished Arcane Season 2. I'm a few episodes in, 1 or 2, I forget where I am exactly. I legitimately had to put the show down for a second. It was getting a little bit too intense for me, just emotionally. But I know some folks have been having some kind of split thoughts on Season 2. I'm kind of curious how I'm going to land on it, but we'll see. I really enjoyed Season 1 for what it's worth. All right, but on to the topic of the episode. Bridget wrote, immediate thought with the poisonous flower names was to look up the scientific names for both azaleas and oleander. They belong to the same clades, I think I'm pronouncing that right, a group of organisms that includes a single ancestor and all of its descendants. And they cite Berkeley, I guess, University as their source. So these include tracheophytes, angiosperms, eudicots, astrids. Tracheophytes are vascular plants, so are a lot of plants, and doesn't lend itself super great for naming purposes. Yeah, I guess you could just do like trace or trach or something, or even just like phyte or something like that. Oleander phyte. It sounds kind of weird, but at least it's a starting point, right? Angiosperms are plants whose seeds are enclosed in fruits. Again, lots of plants. And also isn't ideal for last names. Yeah, that one for sure. I don't think you could work out. Eudicots are merely flowering plants, but that could be a fun last name. I agree. That sounds kind of fun. Astrids are also flowering plants, but would also make a dope last name. I don't know if anyone already said that in the comments. I am literally less than 3 minutes in. Yeah, not the comments that I saw. I didn't go through all the comments though, so it is possible someone brought those up. I'd have to do the fact checking too, which I'm not good at. Bridget wrote, you going into actual help with cultural stuff and me immediately going, let's look at scientific names like everyone loves to do and is a normal occurrence is so real. Yeah, I didn't think of it that way, but that's true. I went right into the like cultural mythology. Bridget's more of the like scientific, technical person. It's why we work well as, creative partners. Bridget wrote, conlang is a made-up language or constructed language. Oh, I see. Okay, so con for constructed, lang for language. That makes plenty sense. Okay. It still follows general rules of language with phonological, grammatical, and syntactical rules. Yeah, I need to know this. As a writer, I feel like this is one of those things that I clearly have as a blind spot that I need to take care of. So like what Tolkien did with the entirety of Lord of the Rings, but presumably on a smaller scale because the linguistics nonsense that man did writing that series is insane. Yes, if you are not aware of the absolute lengths that J.R.R. Tolkien went to in order to write the Lord of the Rings, I mean, the language in that and how intricate it is, it truly is one of a kind. It's one of those things that has not been properly replicated since, at least not on a similar scale. So yeah, pretty helpful from Bridget there. And I think, the more I've thought about this too, since that initial recording, the more it reminds me of sometimes like names, we can take them so seriously, but you can find fun little things to do that are just for you, like little clues and Easter eggs. I'm going to reveal something that not a lot of people know. I know producer Bridget is aware of this, but I don't tell everybody this little thing. But my first fantasy novel, Killer Joy, when it was originally being put together under a totally different name, it's more of like an epic fantasy. And I was having the hardest time coming up with names because it was fantasy. It was kind of a superhero colonial type of fantasy. It was very, very different. It was kind of taking like the superhero stuff of Watchmen and kind of like a more modern version of Lord of the Rings and kind of merging it into its own thing. It's a very experimental novel. And I was having trouble with names because I just couldn't find names that really sounded right. And finally, because I was, a lot younger, this was my first really ambitious novel. And I was looking at it, I was like, what if I just find like a little cheat code, something to purposefully limit what I can name a main character, specifically main characters. So like the 10 key players that I was struggling with, right? And almost all of them are literally just shortened versions of cities or states in the US. So what I did was I took different states and I would look at the word of like a state or a city, and I would see if there was a name inside of that I could mess with. So the main character's name in that novel is Attle, Attle, Seattle. That's literally where I got that. The other main character is Exa, Exa, Texas. I did that for almost every character. There's a character named Ilbray, literally just Millbrae, which is a California, a little area in the peninsula south of San Francisco. It was just like things like that over and over again. And one of the reasons I did that was because, again, it gave me a permission structure to pick a name based on some existing information. So I was limited from the get-go, but that honestly just helped focus me into discerning what the naming structure should be. Because when you read it, if you read Exa, if you read Adel, you're not going to be thinking, oh, okay, so like these are character names based on locations. But I was able to use that as a rubric. And it really worked out, I think, for those novels, because I think those names really stuck out. I was super happy with them. Now, to be clear, I haven't done a naming system like that since. I've been I've had different strategies with my naming since then. But, I think that for the purposes of that novel, it was something that really helped me out when I was a little bit more green and trying to figure out how to come up with these things creatively, especially on the spot. It's always so hard when you're actually in the middle of writing and you don't want to lose the momentum, but then you bring in a character out from nowhere, right? And you're like, well, what do I name them? Because I'm in the middle of writing this, and I usually give people like a little placeholder name, and sometimes the placeholder name sticks, and a lot of the time it doesn't, and that's okay. I think that a lot of these things, you feel it when it's right, and if it's not right, you just have to give yourself a little bit of grace and understanding that you're going to get it eventually. All right, well, special thanks to Bridget for helping us out with that and also teaching me what conlang is. I very much appreciate it. Thank you so much, listeners, for listening to the show. If you have your own advice prompt, something you're curious about, or if you would like me to critique any of your writing, all you have to do is send us a quick email. Our email is fantasywritingforbarbarians@gmail.com. Better tell you the real email. Also, our email is in the show notes, so you can find that there. You can also join our Discord, where you can find the latest episodes and other stuff from the In Between Drafts universe and community. And thank you so much for listening, as always. It's such a pleasure to do this show for you all. And until the next one, be sure to keep on writing, if that's what you feel like doing.